Back in the 80s, Frogger was a smash hit in arcades, but when it came a time to transition to a 3D console game, this little frog fumbled hard. The game's awful camera, unforgiving structure, and unfair level design made it an incredibly stressful game that was much more infuriating than it was fun. But despite flopping critically, it sold like nuts. Over 4 million copies sold. After all those years, there evidently was still interest in Frogger. So why stop there? Let's do a sequel. Frogger 2, Swampy's Revenge. Not to be confused with the 1984 sequel to the original Frogger 2 3D. Hasbro once again handled publishing, but this time the game's development was handled by a different studio. The torch was passed on from SCE Cambridge to Blitz Games, who were previously known as Interactive Studios. And you might know them under that name for developing Glover. Yeah, that's right, this sequel to Frogger actually came from the Glover developers. And yeah, I did actually cross-reference the actual credits before making that claim. There is a lot of people that did in fact work on both titles. Well, I guess that explains those Frogger cameos in Glover, like the minigame that played like Frogger, and the cheat code that also turned you into Frogger. Well, that's sort of exciting. I did rather like Glover. I mean, it did have its flaws. It definitely was a very ambitious title executed in a pretty primitive way, but the thing about Frogger is that it has a much more simple formula, so I feel like if they can make something half decent with a complicated and hard to do idea, they'll probably be able to make something competent with a much more simple idea. Frogger 2 is one of the first games they released under this new name. I'm not too sure why they changed it from Interactive, probably not as funny a reason as why A2M changed their name back to Behavior. Yeah, I know I've mentioned this like a bunch of times already, but I'm gonna take any chance I can get to mention how the developers of Jersey Devil, Scalar, and the Drake and Josh game had to change their name because they accidentally picked an acronym that stood for ass to mouth. That's just too good. Out of the two that are on PlayStation, this seems to be the one that's widely favored. I've had a lot of people tell me that unlike the first game, they did rather enjoy this one, and with the developer that I'm already more than familiar with at the wheel, I have no doubt that this game will at least be decent. Oh, this one actually has a title screen. The first one kinda basked in its arcade origins by opening to a high scores screen, but I already get the vibe here that this game's gonna stray a little bit from those arcade elements. No mention of score, no references to the retro highway stage, there's just a little frog dancing around and having a good time. The colors here are vibrant as hell. This is a really lovely title screen. Not only is it cute and colorful, but there's a lot going on. It's almost like the game's trying to preface itself by letting us peek into the frog's active and bustling habitat, and you can even hop around a little bit, each chunk of the area representing a different menu item. The menus were one of the few things that the previous game actually did do quite well, and it seems like Blitz Games was able to not only capture that again, but even raise the bar a little bit. This is a fantastic title screen. Kinda reminds me of the Banjo menus a little bit, how it's an actual 3D space with tons of characters and animations to represent everything you can click on. This is a degree of effort that I don't see a ton with title screens, so I always appreciate the heck out of it when I do. Like the first game, Frogger 2 plops you right into the first level immediately. The core gameplay remains the same. You tap the D-pad in any of 4 directions to hop to the corresponding tile, and you'll mash the D-pad to continuously propel Frogger through the level. Now, I immediately noticed that the hopping didn't quite feel as good as in the first game, and there is several reasons for that. Firstly, the animation isn't quite as fast as before. It takes slightly longer to hop to each space, though I guess the only reason it was so fast before was because of a frame rate error. Since the developers are based in Europe, they targeted PAL frame rates, and that accidentally made the American version play a little faster than intended. This is part of what made the game so hard, at least the American PlayStation version that I played. But even with that aside, the greater issue here is that the game's frame rate is considerably lower. With simpler graphics, Frogger was able to sustain a consistent 30 FPS, but here it's closer to 20 most of the time, which is likely a hit taken by the vastly improved graphics. And lower frame rates, of course, mean less responsive input. Since a button push can only be recognized on each frame, if those frames take a little longer to occur, each input will also take a little longer to occur, and then you get controls that feel ever so slightly stiffer. It is a rather small complaint, but I couldn't help but to notice it since the game does still have a focus on quick and precise inputs, but that's really the only thing I took issue with. As far as everything else goes, it's all a massive improvement. The level structure has been changed completely. While the goal is is still to collect all 5 baby frogs, this game ditches that open-ended design that kept booting you back to the start in favor of more linear action stages. The goal still involves collecting 5 baby frogs, but they're now placed throughout a linear level, and you'll have to find them as you make your way to the end. They're all placed in plain sight this time, so they operate more like checkpoints in this one. The time limit was also removed, thank God. You can now spend as much time exploring as you want, stress-free. There is a hard mode that does still feature that time limit though, so players that want that extra challenge still have the option. Frogger's moveset has also seen a bit of a rework with new moves and changes to existing moves. The super hop, which was used just for getting to higher areas, can now be strung into a double jump if you hit the X button a second time in the air. This'll skip a tile, so anytime you gotta make a longer than normal jump, you can now do that. Holding the X button will have Frogger do this bizarre glide move, which makes no sense for a frog like him to be able to do, but damn is it ever helpful. Let's say you're making a jump into a moving platform, but you jump a little bit too early. Ooh, the save. You can now slow your descent a little bit to help stick that landing. I didn't use it super often, but it is another tool in the arsenal to help mitigate some of those tiny problems that players might encounter. A quality of life improvement for sure. I kinda wish there was a better way to change the direction you're facing though. If you want to jump over a tile you're not already facing, you gotta press the X button right after hitting the D-pad, and I don't know, every time it feels like it's not what I'm supposed to do, if that makes sense. Like, half the time it felt like it wasn't gonna work or something. I think if they had some way to rotate yourself in place instead, it makes some of those jumps a little bit more comfortable. The croak was also reworked to better show you where the baby frogs are. Before you just heard a croak back if you were somewhat near one, but it didn't really get louder or quieter depending on how close you were, so it wasn't really all that helpful. In this game, the croak sends out a little sound wave, and if there's one nearby, you get a little sound wave back, which actually gives you a general idea of where to look. The tongue move works exactly the same way. It'll still just reach out to gobble up 1-ups and power-ups and stuff, which are also all the same, by the way. There's the auto hop, the faster hop, it's just the same stuff from before. But yeah, this is really solid, actually. This is actually a lot of fun. Like, the gameplay is, once again, as simple as it is effective, but the new moves add a little bit more depth, and the levels have all been reworked to be much more fair and less punishing, while still preserving a decent degree of challenge. Running out of lives will still make you restart a level, but this time when that happens, I actually feel like it's my fault. And upon subsequent attempts, I found myself improving. Getting better at the game is actually fun this time, and because of which, I never found the game frustrating. Even some of the harder levels, like I did die a lot, and I did have to try it a number of times to beat it, but I never found myself annoyed with any poor design. Any challenge the game offered this time around was fair and square. As I mentioned before, the graphics are a huge upgrade. I did like the simple graphics of the first one, but the attention to detail here is undeniably stunning for its time. This is a pretty good looking PS1 game, and the theming is much more distinct this time as well, offering interesting settings like a mine, Egypt, a volcano, even outer space. Each level will offer some sort of unique gimmick as well. The ant colony, for example, has you hopping across the objects that rows and rows of ants are carrying back home, or this graveyard level that has enemies that don't conform to the grid like most other obstacles. There's even a space station level, complete with asteroids, robots, and teleporters. There's a lot of really clever and subtle visual communication to help you avoid stuff, like coding each lane to a different enemy type here. Since a perspective may make it a tad harder to tell what lane to be in from these angles, they make sure to have a unique looking enemy for each lane, so you know what lanes to avoid based on which character you see. It's that kind of genius invisible design that you don't even notice. Most people probably didn't even realize, but on a subconscious level, their thumbs were programmed how to react to each oncoming obstacle. It's brilliant. There's a lot of great little details here, a lot of unique death animations. Sometimes you'll fly up and hit the screen, kind of like Smash Bros. Wait, that was a Mel Blanc scream. That was a stock Mel Blanc screen. What the hell? Didn't like a beta version of Mario 64 use that as a placeholder or something? Yeah, they did. Weird how that's kind of like in the final game here. The game also has a story, apparently? There's a bunch of these weird pre-rendered cutscenes featuring Frogger and his girlfriend Lily as they attempt to save the baby frogs from an evil crocodile named Swampy, hence the title Swampy's Revenge. These cutscenes are kind of ugly as hell. Yeah, I'm gonna be straight with ya, these do not look good. Swampy's a freaking monstrosity, dude, and I'm really not too keen on Lily's design either. She's got like hair or something? You can't just just add hair to a frickin' frog, not when you've already established that the characters are just like regular looking animals. Oh, the artwork in the case looks even worse. I don't like this. I don't know what they were thinking. Like, just making her pink and changing the model ever so slightly is all they had to do. They didn't have to give her hair. You'll swap between her and Frogger as the two split up to tackle different tasks throughout the story, which is a pretty cool idea. There is a coherency here that is reflected by the levels you play, and I do like that. And I mean, while the cutscenes are pretty rough, it's not terribly easy on the eyes, they're still goofy and fun. It doesn't take itself too seriously. I mean, by the end of the game, Swampy's trying to make his own game so he can outsell Frogger's game. It's ugly as hell, but it's also stupid as hell, and I do kinda love that. Frogger and Lily both get captured towards the end of the game, so for the final level, the torch is handed down to one of the escaped baby frogs. I thought that was pretty cute. Like, the idea that you spend the game saving all these little guys, and then in the final level, one of them gets brave enough to save you back, that's pretty cool. Despite having a villain though, there's no final boss fight, or any boss fights for that matter. That is something I would have liked to see them try doing, figuring out how a boss fight could work in Frogger. It would have been interesting to see that. I do remember liking how they handled the boss fights in Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness, so I do know you can make it work with very simple gameplay. Maybe that'll be something I try in one of the upcoming games or something. That'd be cool to see. The only other thing I could say that kind of fell short, in this case literally, is the game's length. It's only about 2 hours long. It's not a particularly long game, but I guess I'd much rather something short and sweet than something artificially lengthened by brutal and unfair difficulty. There are some extras to keep you busy though. A game may be more linear, but there's still a decent incentive to explore a little. Hidden within each level are 25 frog coins. Well, maybe the word hidden is giving it too much credit. Most of them are in plain sight, but it still gives you something extra to go for when completing a level. Getting these will unlock more content, like more multiplayer maps and other playable characters. One of these isn't even a frog, it's a kangaroo named Ruby. I like this guy. His floating animation turns his ears into a helicopter, kinda like Rayman. That's pretty great. The multiplayer is a decent distraction. There's 3 game modes. There's Race, Snake, and Capture the Frog. The Race mode's fairly similar to the multiplayer mode from the first game, in which both players would race to the end of a level, but it was pretty unwieldy in the first game. I mean, the camera was zoomed in enough as it was, and with the screen split in half, you're able to see even less. Luckily though, the split screen was dropped in favor of a dynamic camera that focuses on both players. It still can be a little bit disorienting with how much it can move to compensate for both players, but it's still miles better than before. In the original, you would race to capture more frogs than your opponent, but here the goal is simply to reach the end first. The second game mode is Snake. No, like, yeah, it's like literally just Snake. That's so weird to include that in a Frogger game, but, you know, I guess it fits since we're keeping the minigame simple. Yeah, I'd say it's a fitting inclusion. It's a classic, simple, but fun, so yeah, sure, that works, whatever, why not? The controls could be a little bit more responsive though. Again, with the lower frame rate, I feel like sometimes my inputs would be a tile too late. And lastly, we have Capture the Frog. This one's closer to the first game's multiplayer, where you just race to collect more frogs than your opponent. This multiplayer's not bad. Like, this is actually fairly decent. I could even see myself playing a good chunk of this if I were younger, so I don't have much doubt that maybe some other people got some decent mileage out of it. And that just about covers it. Yeah, I'd say I'm pretty satisfied with that one. It's definitely what the first game should have been, at least in my eyes. I'd say across the board, this is definitely a better interpretation of that simple, classic gameplay into an action-adventure game. I do kind of wish it wasn't this linear, though. I mean, the more open design of the first game was a pretty fun idea. It kind of made it almost Banjo-Kazooie-like. I think if they continued with that sort of level structure, but also continued to not kick you back every time you get a frog, I think that could have been pretty interesting. Some levels do take a slightly less linear approach, and that does add some much-needed variety to the game, but I think going all out like in the first one would have been much cooler in my opinion. It's a very subjective point. There isn't any correct answer here. You know, some people may prefer the linear level design, but this is something I hope they go back to at some point down the road. I guess my only major objective gripe with the game is the low frame rate sometimes, which I suppose is a little bit more forgivable since it's on PS1. A lot of games back then didn't have great frame rates. The hardware was way more limiting, so it's excusable. But if you would like to play it with better performance, there's always the Dreamcast version. That's what I loved about the Dreamcast. It was kind of like a PC version, but for people that preferred consoles. You could play so many N64 and PS1 games at a higher resolution and frame rate. Ooh, here's a silky smooth 60 FPS and it feels great. This is the version I'd recommend if you like playing stuff on older consoles, but I'm sure many others will just go with the Windows version. However you want to go about it, this one I'd say is worth playing. It's a little short, but it's good. And there's solid replay value if you want to get into the time attack mode too. Replaying each level, trying to beat your own best time, it's so much fun. Time attack is a great fit for the Frogger series, so that was a very good addition. Well, that certainly took a a turn for the better, almost made suffering through the first game worth it. Almost. Next up is like when Frogger gets weird. Here they completely ditch the simple gameplay in favor of rebooting it Pac-Man World style, making it a full-on 3D platformer. Instead of letting Blitz games do it again, they completely changed direction and gave it to yet another different studio. And it's really funny because right after this, Blitz put out a game called Zapper. This was a really similar game to Swampy's Revenge, with mechanics and level design that felt like a natural evolution of what they introduced in Frogger 2. I actually reviewed this game a while back because I grew up playing it, but that was long before I was all that familiar with the Frogger games, so my guess now is that Blitz started development on a new Frogger sequel, but after they weren't given back the property, they must have reworked it to feature an original character instead. That is pretty interesting, because Zapper was actually a pretty decent game. Frogger the Great Quest, on the other hand, I have not heard good things, so I am absolutely stoked to see what a train wreck this is gonna be. Another time, stay tuned. Yo, what's up? Thank you so much for watching the video. I'm assuming you watched the video because you're at the end of the video, at the part of the video where I talk about that you watched the video, and I thank you for doing precisely just that. Hey, if you'd like to support the channel, we got a $1 podcast up on patreon.com. Don't forget to click the like button, and don't forget to like the click button.